In this exercise, we are going to take a look at making a simple dress in Atelier using some curves. So we're going to edit our patterns and drop in some curves. So as this can be a rather fiddly and lengthy process in terms of editing the shapes, what we'll do first is just without any avatar, so we're just using the default scene, all we're going to do is drop in a shape and take a look at some of the basics of editing and adding curves. And then once we've gone through that, we'll then load in an avatar and run through the process of making a simple dress. So this is our pattern. All we need to do is just click, drag, and draw out a shape. So ordinarily, if we were just editing this pattern and changing it from a linear perspective, we would use the vertex corners, these control points, in edit pattern. So if we activate edit pattern, we can select one of the corners and manipulate them. If we hold shift key down whilst we're doing this, it will track to an orientation. So this is how we would edit the general shape and keep it essentially linear. So if we just undo that. So to add curves, what we would do is use edit curve. So if we activate that, this then allows us to mouse over an edge and literally click, drag, and drop in a curve. And we can do this in any curve. We might get some errors if our curves overlap. So we have some limitations in terms of how much we can edit or add curves to our straight edges. But in doing this, we essentially are curving a single line. So if we wanted to have more control over how the curve shapes our edge and or where that curve is, what we can do, back in edit pattern, activate that again. What we can do is right click, so we mouse over an edge, right click, and we'll get this pop-up menu, context sensitive menu, and we want split. So mouse over an edge, right click, split. This will give us an add point pop-up dialog. So these are points. So we can add a point in a specific location, or we can just uniform split. So this is essentially like in Blender subdividing an edge. So if we add 3, okay, so that's dropped in. Well, we've got 3 subdivisions, so that's 2 points which create these subdivisions. So with those in place, what we can now do is go back into edit curve, and we've now got a line. Let's just remove those. So click, drag, delete, click, drag to select, delete, because what this has done, this is essentially the same as subdividing a Bezier curve. So because we've essentially subdivided what was a curve, it's added extra curve points where the subdivisions occur. So we need to get rid of these. So now, so that's left click, drag, make the selection, and then delete. So now we can mouse over our edge, and this gives us much better control over where our curvature appears and how it deforms. So here we've added an extra node into this curve, which has allowed us to curve the edge relative to the existing point or vertex. So to get rid of it, select, make sure we're in edit curve, select the curve, or we can click on the point and then just delete. Same again, select, delete. So what we can do is toggle in between the two and edit our mesh, and you can see that we've got a lot of curve points. Select, delete, select, delete. So our curvature points are purple and our vertex control points are black. So again, this is how we can shape our mesh. So when we're making clothing or any fabric design, rather than just trying to control a shape or an edge by using the curve tool and maybe dropping in extra points to curve the edge, what we ideally want to be doing is controlling the placement of our curves by using edge split. So mouse over an edge, right click, split. Let's go with 4. Okay. Then if we toggle back, we'll see a lot of points. We can shift click individual points, highlight, shift click, click, shift click, click, shift click, and then we can use the points and our subdivisions to control how the mesh curves. So this is how we can shape our clothing meshes, toggling between edit pattern to subdivide edges and drop in control points essentially, and then edit curve to allow us to curve specific edges and drop in curve points. And this will allow us much better control over how our mesh deforms to describe the shape of our clothing item. So that's the basics of using the curve tool and the edit pattern tools to add control points and then to control curvature of an edge. So again, that's mouse over an edge depending on the tool. So we've got the edit curve tool, mouse over an edge, click drag, that curves it, or select a point, press delete to remove. Edit pattern, mouse over an edge, it'll highlight, right click, split, we'll get the split or add point dialog, add points, and that allows us to then manipulate these points in a similar fashion to adding the curve. Straighten that out, so click, drag, select, delete, 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 delete. If we get issues deleting curve points, just select them individually. But that now means that we're toggling in between the two modes to shape our specific control points relative to what they are. So that's the basics. Let's design, now that we know this, a simple dress. So new project, that'll clear the scene. Nope. What we're going to do here is load in an avatar. So we've got pre-configured avatars for IMVU, male and female. So open avatar, browse to our files, female, open. We'll get an import dialog or an open dialog. We don't need to change anything here. Okay. So there is the avatar. So with that in place, what we can do now is use our pattern editing techniques to create a simple dress. So before we do that, however, we might want to make sure that we are in select move just select a mesh section of the avatar, it doesn't matter which one, and in the properties editor we want to look for skin offset. At the moment, or by default, it's 1.50. We might want to increase this to 2.50 or 3.50. And what this does is it offsets the fabric simulation from the avatar's torso, so it doesn't get snagged and tied up so readily as it would normally do when the simulation is active. So once we apply this, so let's make an adjustment. We can either click drag the slider or just double click and type 2.50. That's all we need to do. It applies the same value universally because it's essentially assigned to the avatar, and the avatar is the entire mesh collection. So with that done, rectangle, click drag, and just draw in a shape. Select move, and we're just going to adjust the scene a little. So as before, we're going to edit the pattern because we need to add a curve here and essentially a curve here. We're just going to make a simple dress, so there's a cutout for the sleeves and a cutout for the neck. So to do that, we already have a control point that we can slide either way. We can either slide this down here for the control point here, or slide it across here for the control point. But that still means that we have a curve to add. So we have to add a control point somewhere here as well for this curve. So edit pattern. We need to select an edge. This might mean clicking in the workspace to clear any active selections and then mousing over the highlighted edge. Split. Right click, split. Number of splits, we want uniform splits, so increase that to 3. And OK. So we can click select this one, hold shift. Click select this one, hold shift, and move that down. Switch to edit curve. And then as before, we can just grab and drag that edge to create our curve. So all we need to do now is just toggle in between the two modes and make adjustments to the curve. Hold shift. So that we create 1/2 of our fabric. Hold shift. And of course we've got our shape developing in the 3D view. So obviously right now we've only got one side of our mesh. Because we want this to be symmetrical, it's best to essentially design 1/2 of the clothing item, because what we can then do, select move, right click on the pattern and then select symmetric pattern with seam. So right click, symmetric pattern with seam, we'll get a duplicate that we can snap into place and or place to one side. Drop that into place. We'll then be able to add a seam across this gap. So for that, we want to go into segment sewing and then mouse over the edges to sew our fabric together. And at the moment, it's just these two edges. When we do that, mouse over an edge, it highlights. We can do this in the 2D view or the 3D view. So it highlights, we get an arrow pointer which indicates the direction the segment will be sewn. So if we click add, and we move the mouse down towards the bottom, the arrow points up, which crosses the stitching. So depending on what we want to do, we either want them on both the same side or same orientation or not, depending on how the fabric is going to be sewn together. So that's sewn together. So that's the front. And because this is essentially, it's not available at the moment, because this is a duplicate of the original, if we edit this, the edit is reflected in the duplicate. Like so. Now for the front and back, we can use the same patterns. Select move, select both patterns. So that's going to be shift click, right click, and then select instance pattern from the options. So right click, instance pattern. We'll get a duplicate copy of our selection, which we can just drop into place. Move to one side. There is our pattern in the 3D view, which we now need to move into position. So we're going to use the widgets. Hold shift to snap to the rotation. Just move that into place. Like so. And then before we go any further, let's just make an adjustment to this. Let's just save this. So file, save as, project, simple dress 1. Okay. So now that we've got a front and a back, what we need to do is stitch them together. So we've already got a seam stitched down the center, which we did previously. We need to repeat that essentially for the rest of the patterns. So again, for that, we want segment sewing, activate, mouse over an edge, remembering to duplicate or mirror the orientation of the stitch seam. So 1, 2, and again we can do this either in our 3D view or the pattern editor, which can be tricky because of the alignment. So this side is this side, question mark. To make that easier, we just use a 3D view. So that and that one. So yes, that is the two sides. And then of course our shoulder strap. So click, 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 click. So double check, and we might note we need to avoid the stitching intersecting with the avatar. So we might need to adjust our pattern placement. So select move, select our patterns, move them down. Just enough so that they are not intersecting the avatar. We might want to encourage the simulation by just tilting those components in towards the avatar's shoulders to assist the simulation at the shoulders. So we can try simulating our patterns to see what that looks like. So simulation, and there is our basic dress. So again, we can click drag on our outfit and just drag it into position. So that's what our basic patterns look like on our avatar. And there's the bottom. So to adjust this, let's make some adjustments too. So edit pattern, I'm going to make some adjustments to the top, but we do need to be aware that if we zoom out, because this is duplicated from this, if we edit this, it will duplicate to this or mirror to that. So we have to individualize this back section from the front. And the way that we do that is by switching to select move, select our patterns, right click, then from the list, remove linked editing. So right click, remove linked editing. This will disconnect the two halves, front from the back. So if we edit one or the other, we'll see that we can edit one independently of the other. But in doing this, we lose symmetry between the two halves of the back. So we have to address that by select move, select one half and delete, select the remaining half, and we want symmetric pattern with seam as we did before with the front. Do that again, and we'll likely need to rebuild our seams and reposition the mesh. So grab that, move it into position, double check the seams. So we have the shoulder seams, we have the side seams, we don't have the seam between the two halves. So segment sewing again. Again, we can do that in the 2D view or the 3D view, doesn't really matter. Review or simulate. That'll fix that. So now we can edit our patterns of front and back independently of one another. Add our modifications, mirror across as needed relative to the front or the back. So let's save this. File, save as project 3. Okay, so let's edit this dress. So we need to adjust this. So that means we will likely need to pull. So we're in edit pattern, hold shift, watch out for our overlapping curves so we avoid the error. Edit curve. Edit pattern. Let's drag both of those at the same time. Again, keep an eye on our overlap. So if we need to keep this curve at the bottom, but we need to adjust this section at the top, we can add additional curve points by click dragging an edge to add them, like so. So depending on what mode we're in, we don't necessarily need to keep toggling between edit curve and edit pattern. Let's simulate that. So we need to adjust the front. Edit curve. So all we're doing is click dragging on the points or the vertices. Whoops, undo. To shape them. Simulate. It's a very loose fitting dress. Shift to lock to the axes. Edit the curve. So this is going to be a little fiddly and somewhat time consuming. Simulate. Let's see if we can get a little bit more of a curve here. So curve. But we need to avoid simulate and on the back. And that be the basic shape of our dress. And then what we could do to make it a little more interesting, edit pattern, grab the bottom, shift to lock to the axes, move that up, grab the corners, shift, lock to the axes, move those out to roughly the same position, grab the bottom corner, simulate, and that will be our simple dress. So let's save this file, save as, project number 4. Okay. So before we go any further, let's just recap. We dropped in a simple pattern shape, and using edit pattern and edit curve, we edited the shape and got the basic profile that we wanted for one half of the clothing item. We've then duplicated that and essentially mirrored it so that any edits to either or side will replicate or mirror to the other. That gave us the front of the dress. We then duplicated those patterns, front pattern, to create a back panel pattern, but they were linked together. So any edits done to the front mirrored on the back. So we had to disassociate or unlink, remove linked editing to create a unique instance for the patterns, but in doing that we lose the symmetry between the two halves. So we've then deleted one half and then replicated or duplicated the remaining half so that we get the mirrored editing. We then just fixed up all the stitching that was necessary, and that gave us a front and a back, both separately editable from the other. And of course, all we then need to do is just simulate, and that gives us what we see on screen. A very simple dress. So the next step would be to edit the mesh itself and get it prepped for export to Blender. So for that, what we want to do first is display the mesh wireframe. So select move, just make sure we've got one selected, and then fabric, 3D mesh. This shows us the underlying structure of the mesh. So in this case, it's a huge number of triangles. For IMVU and for editing purposes generally, we want this to be squares or quadratic faces. So we want a series of square faces. The way that we do that is make sure one of our patterns, doesn't matter whether we do this in the pattern editor or the 3D view, make sure one is selected, and then in the properties editor we want to scroll down until we find miscellaneous, and here we want to change mesh type from triangle, click on the list, to quad basic or quad. Either or will do. Quad basic tends to present a more optimized iteration of the mesh, whereas quad will display the entire thing just as quadratic faces. We need to do that to both front and back. We might need to then re-simulate just to make sure everything is fitting okay, and we can toggle between the two depending on which one is optimized best for our purposes. So that's step one. So let's save this so we have an archive. Save as project number 5. Then the next step, scroll up to the top. We want to change in simulation properties, we want to change particle distance. Now this will vary depending on how complex the design is and how dense the mesh needs to be for the particular avatar that we are using. Because when we change this, so left click, if we type a lower number, it increases the density. If we type a higher number, let's just do this to the front, it reduces the density. Now obviously that means that a more dense mesh is going to be better for simulation, but there's a price to pay for this because this is such a dense structure. We want to try and avoid doing that for IMVU in particular because dense meshes are expensive. So we want to try and find a compromise. So 40 is too high, 10 maybe a little too low. So let's try 15. Resimulate. And that gives us something that's a little more reasonable. So again, let's save that. Save as, so we have a version. Okay. So now that we've done that, the final step is to sort out the UV maps for the dress. Because right now we could export this as it currently is, but the UV layout is going to be based on the pattern editor. So we need to be able to edit the UVs for our dress to make them more optimal for use in Blender or prep in Blender for IMVU, and then subsequently IMVU when we export for that. So we need to switch to Tools and then the UV editor. This displays a grid that's similar to the pattern editor, but each major grid represents a valid texture space that corresponds essentially to a 256 by 256, 512 by 512, in our particular case, texture image. So each one of these is a valid texture space unit. And what we need to do is map or relocate, position our dress sections within the grid. Now, because of the way that Atelier and other applications work, what this will effectively do is produce one UV map, so it will include both shapes in the same map. But in Blender, what we would get is both of these assigned to the same image. But the layout, how we position these relative to each other, determines how easy it is to then edit and separate the mesh sections to assign their own material and subsequently their own UV mapping. So what we want to do here is just edit our patterns and make them optimal in terms of the amount of space that they occupy within each of these units. So what we can do is just select our UVs, move them together, so we've got a snap option, which essentially combines. It doesn't actually physically join them, it just gives us the impression that we have a single unit UV. So we can assist with this process by enabling the grid or the checkerboard. So we can see a checkerboard and we can see the distribution of the image relative to how we have our UVs laid out. So that just snaps them together. So click, select, snap together, shift click both halves of our dress, and we might note that there are some disparities which we can either address here or in Blender. Either or doesn't matter. So if we want to address these now, so we've got our UV editor open, we want to access the 2D editor. Let's rotate this around so that we can see what we're editing. So home, that's where our tools are. Select a point and let's align these to the grid. As best we can. So shift again. Let's check the front. Make sure that's aligned to the grid. And in this case we can make these minor adjustments because it doesn't really matter too much to the shape of the dress. So make sure the bottom is aligned like so. And of course, because we've made adjustments here, we need to re-simulate. That's resimulated. Everything else is okay. So turn that off. Back to the UV editor. And there we can see our correction. So now that we've done that, select our UV pattern shapes. So shift click and then right click, fill all UV to 0, 1. That will make some minor changes. We can do the same thing to the other shape. Let's make sure those are snapped together. Right click. That will move them into place. But what we can do here, we don't want to overlap. So this is what we want to avoid doing. For Blender, it's best to just have these in their own UV segment, above, below, left or right, the primary UV area, because we can edit those later. So that will be our UV as a dress. So as we can see, we're using as much UV space as we can for each quadrant. So obviously the amount of space that's used will depend and vary on the design of the clothing item. But those are our UVs. So these will be exported for use in IMVU. So when we get this into Blender, we'll see what that looks like. So there's our dress. And our UVs. So when we switch back to the 2D editor, it'll still maintain our pattern layout because it's now using the specific UV layout that we created. So let's just save this. File, save as project 7. Okay. And for our purposes, we don't necessarily need to apply a material to this. But if we wanted to, we just need to select our mesh, any one, because they're all assigned the same material. Select our fabric, and then we can edit some of the properties in the property editor that are associated with our fabric material. So there are some presets that we can use. Fabric library, which will open up different set of presets that we can assign to our mesh. Okay. And this will be exported alongside the rest of the mesh. So let's just save this. Again, just so that we have an archive, and then export. So for that, File, Export, and then select our format. In this case, we want to use FBX. This just makes it easier to transfer across to Blender. Give the file a name or the default, and then export. So this will bring up a export dialog where, depending on what we want to include with the FBX export, we can set. So if we only want the mesh, which we do in this particular instance, we want to disable all props and all avatars. So that will just export the dress, the outfit, the meshes. Next, we want to enable unified UV coordinates if we want to keep the UV map that we created before. If we don't, this will export the UVs based on the pattern editor layout. So that might mean that they overlap or are collated together, one on top of the other. So if we want to keep the map that we generated, we want unified UV coordinates. Then finally, if we want to include the material, the fabric that we added to the item, we want to bake the respective textures. In this case, all we need are bake texture and bake normal map. And optionally, set the baking size. So this is the image that we're going to be baking to. In our case, that's 512. Bleeding size, we can leave that at the default. Everything else is okay. So for the mesh, all patterns, we don't need props or avatars. Everything else here is okay. We want to make sure that unified UV coordinates is set to keep the UV map or the UV layout that we generated. Bake textures if we want to include the material that's assigned to the mesh. And then everything else is okay. So all we need to do is click on OK and complete the export process. So that's now exported in FBX, which we can then import into Blender. So in Blender, what we want to do here is, as a general rule of thumb, import the dress on its own into a clean Blender file, because we need to do some prep work before we assign that or append it into a clothing tool project. This just makes the process easier because we're focusing on a step within the process. So we import, get everything set up, and then we append it into a clothing project. So starting from the default scene, so if we haven't got a default scene, new general, that will just reset everything. And then file, import, and we want FBX. That's the file format that we used. FBX, browse to the file, number 7, then check our export settings. These are okay, these are okay, that's okay, no animation, double check, armature, don't need anything here either, so then all we need to do is click on import FBX. So that will have brought something in, and we can confirm that in the outliner with this new object instance, cloth piece. That is the dress, but it's tiny because there's a huge scale difference between the two applications. So if we zoom in, there is our dress. So we have to prep this and get it scaled up so that it's usable in Blender and with the toolkit. So in the outliner, make sure cloth piece is selected. Then in object properties, we want to take a look at scale and change the X, Y, and Z coordinates from 0.01 to 1. Do that for all of them. And there is our dress. So before we go any further, let's just save this now that we've got it into Blender. So save as Simple Dress 10. So first thing we want to do is double check and see what materials have been brought in. So we've got our mesh, switch to material preview, and that will display the material on our mesh. Select one segment, again because this is 4 segments. Material properties, there is our material. So let's just rename this fabric. Scroll down to the bottom, backface culling, enable backface culling for the camera. That's disabled backface on the front material. Backface culling on the back. So let's call this fabric underscore back. So we've got fabric, or let's rename this fabric underscore front, fabric underscore back. So we've got two materials assigned to the front of the dress and the back. And we can see by disabling backface culling, what we're doing here is just basically checking to make sure the mesh is facing the right way, so we don't have any surfaces that are inside out or inverted and facing inwards. So that's our basic material. Check the node setup, shading workspace. There's the mesh, the dress, and this is our material. So it's brought in. Let's just organize this a little bit. So it's brought in a normal map, an alpha, which is essentially just the cutout, and our diffuse. So that's the wool texture itself, that's the black. So that's okay. Those are usable in IMVU. And then what we want to do now is check the UV map. So UV editing. It's got the back selected already, and we can already see half the UV. If we switch back into object mode, select both mesh sections, edit mode, there we can see our UV map. So we've got a little bit of an overlap in the center here. So we can address that by UV, round to pixels, and corner. So this basically snaps to the pixels, and it will allow us to then, relative to each other, so as a pair, we can scale this, just do a little scale tweak, and what this does is it adjusts the UVs and snaps everything to the pixels. Then what we can do, Alt click that leading edge, move. We want to join those together, but all we've done here is shifted the alignment because these are still two separate meshes. Edit mode, object mode, make sure both are selected, object, join, object, join. So we're going to join these physically together. That joins them together. We then need to do a little bit of editing, edit mode. Right now, there is a split down the center there, so we need to fix that. So select all, then mesh, clean up, merge by distance. So this is going to remove what are in effect duplicate vertices. So we've got two vertices in pretty much the same locations coordinate wise. We need to remove those so that there is only a single row of vertices, edges down this center. So select all, mesh, clean up, merge by distance. We'll get a confirmation. So that's removed 49 vertices. So now, so Alt click, just press the G key. Those are all moving in unison, so that's okay. Select all. That now means that our UV map is a solid. So if we use island select, which will allow us to select the entire UV segment, we can select the entire thing. Just press the G key, move that around, and that is the back. So if we just switch to, so click drag, material preview, we can see our material assignment. So we now need to repeat that for the front. Object mode, select the front. Let's just quickly check the UVs. edit mode. So the UVs are offset because that reflects the layout that we created in Atelier. And this is why we use the grid in Atelier, because this UV is positioned in a way that it'll snap exactly into place in our valid texture space. So if we select both of those, hold Control, we can snap that to the grid and it will sit right on top of the baked image that was created in Atelier when we exported. So same again, vertex select or edge select, either or. Select that center edge, just match that up. So alt click, just get those to match up. This just saves us having to fiddle with that after the fact. Object mode, both meshes are selected. Object, join. Same again, edit mode, make sure everything's selected, select all, mesh, clean up, merge by distance. There's our confirmation again, 43 vertices. So now we can use our island to do the same thing. So island selection, escape. So that, exit, is our dress prepped and ready for use with the clothing tool. So let's just save this file, save as 11. So just to recap, we've imported the dress mesh into a clean Blender file. We've rescaled it to make sure it's the correct size for IMVU and for working in Blender. We've then checked the materials, renamed where appropriate. We've then checked the shader. So the front is the same as the back essentially, but with the, so we've got our baked, images. So the front, diffuse, the mask or the alpha, and then the normal map. So we've got that for both the front and the back. The UV map, because of the export options that we used when exporting from Atelier, that's kept the UV map of the mesh, so we don't have to do too much editing to this. There may be some need to join the seam down the center depending on how the mesh was made, whether we've kept it in quadrants or not, but the UVs will sit correctly relative to the available texture space and the grid therein essentially. So the next step, now that we've got all of that done, is to append this into a clothing tool project. To make that step easy, one step we could do, make sure the mesh is selected, object properties. Let's rename this dress underscore front dot mesh. Let's just make sure that it's obvious that this is a mesh. Dress back dot mesh. So we've got a front and a back. We also, let's just hide the cube. We also need to detach it from this object at the bottom here. So basically the two meshes are connected to this empty. We want to unparent everything for use in the toolkit, so we don't want to cause any problems or confusion. So click drag selection, make sure all that's selected. Object, parent, clear and keep transformation. So object, parent, clear and keep transformation. So now when we append this into the clothing file, it'll just bring in the meshes. And we've got those here. So let's just save this again. And then we can create our clothing project. So to do that, what we need to do is just create a new project. So new general. Just reset everything essentially. And then access the toolkit. View sidebar. There's the toolkit. And we want the clothing tool. Click the heading, click on the button. And that will load in the default avatar. So we want to change this, the gender, to standard female. In this particular instance, we want to use the standard female because that's what was used in Atelier to design the clothing item. Then once we've done that, all we need to do is File, Append, browse to the location of our clothing item, simple address 12, double click. In this mode, append, browsing to a file acts like a zip archive, which has internal structure that we can drill down into. And here we want the object folder. Double click, and there are our two meshes. So click, shift click. We can leave these options as is, and then just append. And that will bring our meshes straight into the project, ready for the remaining step of setting this up for IMVU. So now that we've done that, let's just save this. File, save as 13, save. So now that we've got that in place, first thing we want to do is just a little bit of prep to get this ready for setup as a clothing item. So we need to join the two halves of the dress together. So click, shift click, object, join. This just ensures that we are working with a single mesh. And as with joining the two halves of each side together, we need to edit mode, make sure everything is selected, and then mesh, clean up, merge by distance. So that now means that we have a joined edge loop down the sides. We're not dealing with two separate halves. So back out into object mode. We don't need to necessarily do anything to the materials, because that's brought in the material information from the setup file. So this is exactly as we would expect it to be. So it's brought in the correct materials and the correct setup. Same with the UV maps. So this is why, so that's got both being displayed at the same time, but they are separate maps associated with individual images. But this is one of the reasons why we do the setup in a separate file, so that we aren't bringing in any unnecessarily information or data. So back to layout. So to make this work, we need to bind the mesh to the armature or the skeleton. What this will do is then drop in a set of groups, vertex groups, onto the mesh that correspond to individual bones that allow those bones to control certain regions or areas of the mesh relative to the bone they correspond to or with. So for that, we select the mesh, and in the toolkit, we just click on Bind to Armature. That will bind to the armature, and we'll get a confirmation with a highlight of the skeleton. And we can confirm this by selecting the mesh, and in Object Data Properties, we should find a whole set of vertex groups. Now, each one of these corresponds to specific bone of the armature. And it's these that create the link between the mesh structure, and the skeleton or the armature and the individual bones within it. So what we can do now that that's done, is pose the avatar or pose the skeleton. So click on the pose button, or from the interaction menu, make sure the skeleton is selected, pose mode. And what this will do is it'll toggle us into pose mode, where we can select. It's best to use the orange bones because they are set up with basic IK controls which move a limb. So these arms are okay. Grab the chest, press the G key, that's okay. Obviously we're going to get clipping in the more extreme poses the avatar can be deformed into, so we have to make an assessment as to whether we want to make adjustments to the groups so that we accommodate this kind of clipping in these sorts of extreme poses, because obviously we are relying on the fact that the avatar will be posed in this kind of extreme position. Generally speaking, that's not necessarily going to be the case, but we have to decide whether we want to accommodate that. So let's just reset the pose. We've also got the legs to check. Skeleton, pose. And we can see that we've got quite a bit of clipping when the legs are being used. So let's just pose that. So we can see that moving the shin bone or the lower leg should ideally just move this bottom section of the mesh, but we can see we've got some clipping at the waist and the chest or breast area. That means that there's a bone in this chain that is inadvertently influencing these sections. So we need to remove that influence or control from whatever bone is causing that errant deformation. So that's one consideration we have to keep in mind. The other one, aside from clipping the butt, we have to keep in mind that the weight paint values that we associate with individual bones is going to be determined, or the deformation of the mesh will be determined by the design of the mesh itself. So let's just switch back into solid mode just to make this a little easier to see. So because of the design of the dress, there is no accommodation essentially between the legs. So when one leg moves, it's going to pull all of this section of the mesh to accommodate whatever pose is being created. And that generally means we're going to get some clipping on the inside back typically, and or the inside front of the leg, because this mesh is being pulled out of shape quite significantly to accommodate the poses. And this is where most of the editing to the weight paint values and the way that they influence the mesh, this is where most of our time is going to be spent trying to compensate for and or fix clipping errors like this. And again, keep in mind that there are limitations to the degree to which that is possible because of the design of the outfit and the amount of limited, let's just reset the pose, and the amount of limited surface data or mesh structure there is available to stretch across those bigger distances. So those are our two main considerations when we're weight painting. One is that we don't have errant influence over the mesh from one bone to another. Let's go back into object mode. In fact, what we can do to make this easier, object properties, viewport display, enable wireframe, so we can see the wireframe of the outfit. So just to recap, two considerations or two primary concerns. We need to keep an eye on how much of the mesh is being distorted relative to specific bones. We need to watch out for errant deformation of the mesh in areas that should not be being deformed by the particular bone that we are manipulating. And the second concern is the distortion and clipping that can occur in these extreme poses because there isn't enough mesh data to stretch between bone controls and or the pose that's being created by manipulating the skeleton. So what we want to do here then, let's just save this so we have an archive. File, save as 14. So for weight painting and editing that, select the mesh and then click on the Paint Weights button. If we're in solid mode, solid shading, the mesh will turn blue, indicating that it's ready for weight paint editing. And then to select a specific bone, we can use the vertex groups list. So we want to be in object data properties so that we can see the group list, because what we can do here is select a group and it will highlight corresponding mesh section. So all we need to do, let's do the leg because that was clipping. So left, those are our fingers. There we go. Left hip, left thigh. So we can see the thigh bone is here and its influence goes all the way up here. We need to adjust that so that the influence essentially cuts off at the waist. We need to do that for both, likely both right hip and left hip. So that's the left thigh, left hip, right hip, right thigh. And we can see here, this is why the chest clipped. So what we can do for this is just pose the skeleton. Doesn't matter how. Drop out of pose mode, switch back into paint weights. Make sure the appropriate group is selected. And then in a 3D view, we have these tools. We have weight, which corresponds to the color that we're seeing. So dark blue is 0 influence and red is 100% influence. So that means that the thigh bone has 100% influence over this section of the mesh, and it has about probably 0.1, 0.2 influence over the chest area. So that's the weight value, and that's really the one that we want to focus on. It's just the weight. So if we click drag or type 0, we can then paint over the mesh and remove influence the thigh has over that section of the mesh. And we can see as we're doing that, it's nullifying the influence that bone has over these sections of the mesh. So for example, it's influencing the left-hand side, which we don't want it to do, so we have to paint all of this out. And it'll be the same on the back. And we can see how that changes how the mesh deforms. So what we need to decide is where our limits are. Generally speaking, if it's a left and a right, we want to try and do a division down the center line. But getting those values correct relative to what we're doing is going to be time consuming and involve quite a bit of trial and error. But we can see how just that small area, how that's changed our mesh. So let's just do quickly the other side. So that's right thigh. So we want left thigh. So again, we can see how the left thigh influences the right side when it shouldn't. And at the top here. So we're basically going to repeat the process, exactly what we've just done on the right side, now onto the left side. And that's basically the entire process of weight painting and trying to get our meshes, our clothing items, to properly deform relative to the avatar. Is this is all it is. We are selecting individual groups once we've got bind to armature set, and once we have our groups assigned to our mesh, it's then just a question of dropping in and out of paint weights and pose mode to check the pose, and painting or editing the influence the individual bones have on the mesh to change how it's deforming the item. So as we are basically just repeating the same process for weight painting, so we're selecting our groups, painting the mesh, posing, etc., etc. We're just going to jump ahead and pause whenever we need to cover something. So reset the pose, select the armature, pose, flip the leg around, select the mesh, paint weights, so left thigh. So there isn't a quick way of doing this, because essentially this is all weight painting is. It's just painting over the mesh to adjust our weight values so that the mesh deforms as best as it can relative to its structure when the avatar skeleton or the armature is articulated. So dropping out of weight painting, that looks to be the best that we can do based on the design of the outfit. We can just do a quick test. We can use, there's an animation built into the pose file that we can use to do a very basic articulation test where we can check the deformation of the mesh. In addition to this, there are a couple of bones that should have absolutely no influence on the mesh at all. So, root and the X bones, X tip bones. So, a quick way, aside from weight painting them out using 0 weight, an alternative way to remove those having influence over any part of the mesh, which is what we want to do. We want to avoid those influencing the mesh in any way, shape or form. Switch back into object mode, select our mesh, edit mode, let's just go into wireframe so we can see this more easily. Deselect none. So we want to select none. And what we want to do, object edit properties again, vertex groups. We want to select the vertex groups that should not influence the mesh in any way, shape or form. And then using the buttons down at the bottom, we want to use select, deselect, remove. Well, we don't need to use a sign in this case. So select. That will highlight all the vertices that are being influenced by that group. We want to remove the influence, so we click on remove. That will remove that bone's influence over the mesh. So if we deselect, we can double check this. So if we use deselect now, that will not deselect anything because that group has now been removed from the mesh in terms of its influence. So none, and then we can use the select and deselect buttons to double check. And of course now we don't have any selections being highlighted in the 3D view, so that group is removed. X-tip bone 86. And all of these groups can inadvertently have an influence over the mesh. So whilst we've been painting our groups, some of these will influence inadvertently some of the areas that we are painting, which will cause the mesh to deform incorrectly relative to the actual bones that should be influencing. So we want to try and get rid of these. So the best way of doing that is, as described, vertex groups. So select, remove, select none. Let's double check. That's okay. There shouldn't be any finger tip bones influencing the mesh, but we need to check just in case. So that removes all of the groups that should have no influence over the mesh whatsoever. So we can drop back into object mode, and then all we need to do is finish up our weight painting. So that is our outfit weight painted and ready for export. So let's just save this. So the weight painting process is not necessarily complicated, but it's a long drawn out process in terms of what has to be done in order to get the mesh to work with the avatar. And it's complicated relative to the design of the outfit. And if the outfit is not symmetrical, that adds to the complications of weight painting generally. So now that we've done that, let's just save over that again. We're almost ready to export. But before we do, we just need to do a quick couple of checks. First, we need to make sure that the dress or the mesh is inside the correct collection. So in Outliner, scroll all the way down to the bottom, double check that the mesh is in clothing export. If it's not in there, it won't be exported. So in this case it is there, but if it were not in that location, select the mesh, object, collections, move to collection. This will bring the move to collection pop-up up. Mouse over clothing scene, and then we have clothing export, and this will then move the mesh into that location. So we've already got that in there, so it won't really do anything. Next, let's just double check the material. So shading workspace. So our material exported from Atelier brought in an opacity map. We don't really need this, so we can disconnect that from the front and the back material. This just saves us having to edit or change that in Studio. So we've got our diffuse and the normal map. That's all we need. Back to layout. And then finally, we could export this just on its own, the mesh on its own, which would allow us to set this up as a layerable item. But because this was made using the default avatar as essentially our template or form over which the dress was made, we might want to include those sections of the avatar body with the clothing item. Because the likelihood is that if this is imported on its own, it won't necessarily fit over the top of the avatar because of the different body shapes and dev kits and all sorts of other things that are available now. So to do that, let's just save this before we export. Save incremental. So to do that, select the torso and the hips or pelvis, and then shift click the dress. So we want to select all three sections or all the components of the avatar, the underlying avatar that we actually want to include. So we could also include the legs as well. Like so. Dress, and then export. So the difference is that when we export this, it's going to export all of these selections as part of the same FBX instead of just the dress on its own. And we'll see what that does in Studio. So let's just export. Export. So there is our message confirming export. So now we have an FBX we can bring into Studio. So in Studio, we want to create our new project. And this was a female clothing item. So women, clothing, all clothing, and we can use the female top. Derive. There's the base avatar based on our inventory. All we need to do now is import our FBX. So import FBX, find the file. There it is. So open. So select, open. So this is the import dialog. It's found 5 meshes. So set up FBX. So it's going to import our meshes relative to overriding the existing body parts. So left leg, abdomen, hips, right leg, chest and arms or torso, and then our dress. So we can give that a slightly different number. doesn't really matter which. This will allow this to sit over the top of these. So 32, that's okay. Next. There are our materials. So front and back, and the skin, we can sort that out in a moment once we've imported. So next. No animation, so these are the test animations that are in the Blender file that are exported, so we can ignore those. So deselect, review, that's what's going to be brought in, and then import. There is our dress. So we've got a missing skin. So in component, select the female skin material, click on diffuse, so we want to click on the preview and just select the skin or the image from the list. Preview. That will show the skin. Let's turn on the MCG for ease of viewing. And that is our dress imported into Studio. Now, obviously, we've got some clipping that we have to take care of. So, this is basically the process. We have now got our dress. Let's just make this two-sided actually. So select our dress materials. Material properties, scroll down to the bottom, and we want double-sided. Preview. And the back, same again. Double-sided. So we can see both sides of our mesh. So yes, that is the process of bringing our dress made in Atelier, prepped in Blender, and finally imported into IMVU. But obviously we've got some clipping because of the poses. So all we need to do now is just go back and forth between Blender, weight painting, re-exporting, re-importing, reassembling the product in Studio to alleviate these issues. And obviously once we're done with the project in terms of fixing all the issues, file, save as simple press. We then fill out the info. Let's just use that for now. Select, set our icons, title, rating, price, and then submit. That is our dress in IMVU. And here it is with issues fixed.